There are roughly 150,000 square kilometres of land in England and Wales. Yet, of this, only 8% is publicly accessible. Despite our rich history of being nature lovers, it's becoming increasingly difficult to simply access the outdoors. But why? How did we get to where we are now, and more importantly, how do we get to where we need to be? To answer these questions, we need to travel back in time and head to the United States of America. In 1864, President Abraham Lincoln granted the Yosemite Valley to the state of California for public use, resort and recreation for all time.
This moment marked the first time that a government had set aside land for the sole purpose of the public's pleasure. But the Americans weren't done yet.
Less than a decade later, following an expedition into the land of Yellowstone, the US Congress passed the Act of Dedication, legislating that the land be reserved and withdrawn from settlement or sale and set apart for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. And thus, on March 1st, 1872, the world's first national park was created. Where the Yosemite Valley had been owned by the state of California, Yellowstone became federally governed territory, and the maintenance of the land became the sole responsibility of the federal government. At the same time, in Yosemite, a man named John Muir was making a name for himself. Muir was a passionate preservationist and a nature writer who believed that the wilderness was pristine land and should be kept this way for all to experience. His philosophy was that wild lands had an intrinsic value all of their own, even going as far as to liken nature to a temple. In 1890, his articles convinced Congress to establish Yosemite as a national park, and at the turn of the century, following a camping trip with President Theodore Roosevelt, Yosemite became federal land, providing it with additional levels of protection and maintaining it for future generations. Meanwhile, in the UK, we had finally discovered that walking could actually be fun. Following on from the Romantic movement came a shift in the way that people perceived walking. Suddenly, it had become something that you could do for pleasure, and soon organisations and clubs started emerging for these walkers, or ramblers as they were called.
However, there weren't many places that ramblers could ramble. The majority of land in the UK was privately owned, trespassing was illegal, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to access what should have been common land thanks to the enclosure movement. On many occasions, ramblers were being forcefully evicted by the wealthy landowners. In 1884, Liberal MP James Bryce introduced a bill to Parliament, stating that no owner or occupier of uncultivated mountains or moorlands in Scotland shall be entitled to exclude any person from going on such lands for recreation or scientific or artistic study, or to molest him in so walking.
The bill failed, but the campaign for Right to Roam had begun. Already ramblers were starting to independently trespass on land in protest for their rights.
This all came to a head on the 24th of April 1932, when hundreds of men, women and children gathered at Kinderscout for a mass trespass. While the trespass itself didn't get much attention, it was a response from police and landowners which did. When they returned from the march, 5 ramblers were arrested and imprisoned for incitement to cause riotous assembly. This led to a big public outcry and the official founding of the Ramblers Association.
Eventually, 17 years later, and 70 years after Yellowstone, the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act was established. Thanks to the Kinderscout trespass in April 1951, the Peak District became the first national park in Britain, with 9 others following in that decade.
However, just because this land is designated as a national park, doesn't mean you're allowed to go wherever you want on it. In fact, only a third of the Peak District is open access land, which brings up an interesting dilemma.
In the UK, the land within a national park is not necessarily owned by the government. In fact, the largest share of land owned by the national park authorities is in the Brecon Beacons, with 13%.
Organisations like the MOD, water companies and the National Trust own significantly more land than the MPAs. However, on average, over 85% of the land in national parks is privately owned. Therefore, in accordance with the IUCN's internationally accepted standard, these parks are not actually national parks, but rather some pretty landscapes with slightly more restrictive planning laws.
But obviously not restrictive enough.
Dartmoor was designated a national park in October 1951, the 4th in the UK. The Devon County Council took on the responsibility to preserve and enhance the natural beauty of the moors. 12 years later, proposals were presented for a bypass across Northern Dartmoor, and in 1986, work begun.
Now, I'm not sure about you, but Personally, I don't think this preserves or enhances any natural beauty.
And this demonstrates the main difference between national parks in the UK and the US. Ours have a much bigger focus on agriculture, with livestock roaming around freely, whilst in the US, they're much more focused on conservation and preservation.
This is a particularly important issue here, as Dartmoor is very different from other national parks.
Since 1985, with the introduction of the Dartmoor Commons Act, much of it has become open access land, and the public has a right of access to the commons on foot and on horseback for the purpose of open air recreation. It's the only place in England and Wales where wild camping is permitted without approval from the landowner, and has been since 1985. Well, almost. 3 years ago, our right to wild camp on Dartmoor was contested. A case brought up by Alexander Darwell, the 6th largest landowner on Dartmoor, was accepted by the High Court, and our legal right to camp was lost.
People didn't like that. At all. On the 21st of January, over 3,000 people showed up on the Darwell's land, one of the largest protests in the history of the Right to Roam campaign. The case made national news and sparked the creation of the organisation, The Stars Are For Everyone.
And it worked. The Court of Appeal overturned the decision in July 2023. And in 2025, following a lot of back and forth, the Supreme Court ruled that wild camping always was and always will be legal on Dartmoor.
So, we won. But the issue is, have the Dartmoor set a precedent? Will landowners keep trying to restrict our access to the countryside? Dartmoor is the only place in England and Wales where wild camping is legal, and even that is limited to certain areas. We have roughly 300 square kilometres of land where we can pitch a tent. That is it.
Except, it's kind of not.
If we look at the legal definition of trespassing, the Met Police defines it as a civil offence. The same fact sheet states that a person will not be criminalised for their mere presence on the land. Of course, there are certain caveats towards this, but by following the rules of responsible wild camping and respecting the landowner and the land itself, it's unlikely that you would ever come across any issues. So why am I bringing this up?
Firstly, it's important for all hikers and ramblers to know their rights. Those signs that say trespassers will be prosecuted, they're a lie. According to the Right to Roam campaign, you cannot face criminal prosecution simply for being on someone else's land without permission. I mean, there's a chance the landowner might sue you, but they'd have to know who you are and go through all the trouble, and the amount they'd win would only be proportional to how much damage you do, which, assuming you leave no trace, will be virtually nothing.
And secondly, well, I'm not actually camping in a spot where it's allowed. You see, if I were to set up my tent over here, then that's perfectly fine, no problems whatsoever. But if I was to be so disrespectful as to hop over this imaginary, arbitrary line here and set my tent up over here, as I have done, well, what I've done is very bad indeed. Now, of course, I'm not encouraging you to trespass. I just thought I'd state some facts, and I'll leave it up to your capable judgment as to what to do with them. It's also important for me to mention that these landowners do, on occasion, have a very valid reason for not wanting us on their land. As hiking and wild camping in particular have become more popular, there's been a definite rise in the number of people fly camping. People who either don't know or simply don't care about the principles of leave no trace. And not only are these people ruining it for the rest of us by alienating the landowners, they're also causing untold damage to the ecosystems of this land, the few wild places that we have left for the rest of us to enjoy.
So, where does this leave us?
We're still a long way from something like Scotland's Land Reform Act or the Everyone's Rights found in Nordic countries. And while the Countryside and Right of Way Act has introduced new footpaths, they're very unevenly distributed across the country and only provide a thin sliver of access. What's more, many landowners are still actively fighting to stop people from walking on their land.
But what do we need to help? Well, you.
You see, we didn't just happen to get to where we are now. No one woke up one day and decided to simply give us our rights. They were fought for by people just like you and me. People who knew they deserved better. People who just wanted to go for a walk and explore the country they live in.
Nowadays, there are organisations and campaigns like the BMC, the Ramblers Association, and Right to Roam, who are lobbying for change. But but they need us to show that we do actually care about this.
So, join a club, sign a petition, write to your MP, or just simply go on a walk and exercise the rights you have now. Act as if you're already free, because otherwise you never will be. History has shown us that we can make a difference, but to do so, we're going to need all the help we can get. And that starts with you.